Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Czechast, the podcast where we explore all things Czech but in English. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and this special episode comes out during Diplomacy Week 2025, which is organized by the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is taking place across the country. The aim is to give the public and students a closer look at what diplomacy actually involves and how it connects to everyday life. With that in mind, I decided to speak to Dr. Ivan Dubovický from the Communications Department of the Ministry, an author of a book called Czechs in America. It's a subject that touches not only on history, but also on public diplomacy, because understanding the role of Czech communities abroad, not just in the United States, is an essential part of how the country represents itself to the world. From early explorers to post-Cold War émigrés, Czechs have made a lasting impact on American society. As Dr. Dubovický explains, it goes all the way back to the 16th century.
I would start with Joachim Ganz. He was a Prague-born Jew who is considered to be the first scientific scholar on American soil, what is today United States.
By the way, we also discussed the long-standing myth about Jan Amos Komenský, or Comenius, and his supposed invitation to lead Harvard College.
It was mentioned in a very famous ecclesiastical history of Cotton Mather, Magnalia Christi Americana, but many historians disagree with this because searching through the papers of Jan Amos Komenský, there is not a single evidence of this invitation.
We didn't avoid some of the kind of less idyllic subjects about the Czech and Slovak community in the United States. For example, how Cold War exile communities were united in opposition to communism, but there were tensions along the kind of national, religious and generational fault lines.
They always opposed communist regime, but their ideas about how to organize Czechoslovakia after communist regime differed very drastically, I would say. So you can find these tensions everywhere, I would say.
So why is such a book important?
Because I always felt that we here in what is today Czech Republic, we forgot the great contribution the Czechs abroad in general and especially in the United States contributed to us.
Says Dr. Ivan Dubovický. You are listening to Czechast and I'm Vít Pohanka.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
My name is Ivan Dubovický and I'm currently working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, Department of Communications. So why I do that, I spent this year, I'm going to celebrate 30 years with this institution, so I passed through several departments and now I'm glad to work here because this department is very specific. It gives you a lot of challenges. Basically every day we are taking care of our embassies abroad, their cultural and public activities. We are taking care of activities here in Czechia related to Czech foreign policy. And of course we also take care of our visitors, guests, preparing some public announcements about foreign policy, preparing press releases and so on and so on. So it's very challenging and basically every day brings something new.
I'm here today to ask you mainly about Czechs and Moravians and Silesians who left for the United States and perhaps Canada as well, North America. But we are recording this interview in a very, very special place. Where are we now and what is interesting about this place?
We are now at the Černín Palace. It is the main seat or the headquarters of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And This specific space is what we call Jan Masaryk apartment. Jan Masaryk was the last democratically elected foreign minister of Czechoslovakia before communist coup d'etat, and the reason why we call it after his name is because he ended up tragically right in this apartment. So far we do not know. There are several hypotheses about his death. We do not know whether it was a suicide or a murder. If it was a murder, who was behind it, and so on and so on.
But it happened just a few days after the communist coup d'etat in 1948, on the 10th of March, if I remember
Yes,
correctly.
exactly.
Right. So, I know that you have visitors. You actually allow visitors inside here. So, what is interesting about this apartment?
Well, we call it Jan Masaryk apartment, but it's slightly incorrect because originally, as far as we know, the apartment was occupied by the very first Czechoslovak foreign minister, Eduard Beneš, who later became the second president of Czechoslovakia. And then his followers, Professor Kamil Krofta and some others, during Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia during Second World War, it served to Reichsprotectors for their official meetings, ceremonies and so on. And after the war, it was Jan Masaryk who had his own apartment in London, but strangely he didn't have any apartment here in Prague. So he was very happy to use this apartment for himself.
Was he the last minister who used it as a living place?
As far as I know, his successor, the first communist foreign minister, Vladimir Klementis, used it also briefly, but then it was Vladimir Klementis who decided that the apartment will be used exclusively for official meetings and not for private purposes of the minister.
And that's how it is used even now, right?
Yes, of course.
Of course. By the way, let me just rewind a little bit. You mentioned the time of the Protectorate, Böhmen und Mähren. So Heydrich also used it?
They all used it, but they had their own private apartments, or as in case of Reinhard Heydrich, as you know, he lived in Panenské Břežany. But of course, it was still distant from Prague, so occasionally some of these Reichsprotectors used the apartment. We know positively that, for example, there are other areas adjacent to this apartment that were used by Reichsprotector and even their wives for their specific visitors.
Now, Jan Masaryk obviously spent some time in America, didn't he, as well as a young man?
He spent a lot of time in the United States. Even before the First World War, he spent nearly 7 years because he wanted to prove to his parents that he could be a self-made man. You know his parents, Thomas Garrick Masaryk, successful professor, politicians even before the First World War, and then he became first president of independent Czechoslovakia. But Jan didn't reach any success in America, so in 1913 he came back. Then he served in military service during the war in Austro-Hungarian army, and after the war in 1919 he entered diplomatic service. And since that time he served here for this ministry basically up to his death in March 1948.
Why don't we sit down now?
Okay.
I recently spoke to a colleague of mine, and he has this kind of unfavorable view of Jan Masaryk in a way. Yeah, I mean, he respects that. Of course, he was the foreign secretary, the last democratic foreign minister, rather in Czech terms, we should call it. However, I mean, he didn't have much of an education, did he?
Yeah, you're right that some historians say that he didn't even finish his college studies. But it doesn't matter. He was a very intelligent man. He spoke several languages. And for example, we mentioned his stay in America before the First World War. And some people say that he was forced to spend some time in a special institution for mentally retarded girls because of his mental problems. But I would argue, yes, he needed some rest because of the mental pressures he went through. But on the other side, can you show me mentally retarded man who translated works of Russian writers from Russian to English Yes, so he was naturally intelligent, and he proved it, very gifted, and he proved it, of course. For example, during the war, he could easily handle, he learned 2 languages, Polish, partly Hungarian, and of course Russian, relatively easily. I don't know how some of us, but it took me years and years to handle at least a little bit my English. So I admire him. And the fact is, as you mentioned, that some historians, and not only historians, even people, public people, were very critical of him because he could do more, for example, in opposing communist regime and so on. But on the other side, he was a man of bohemian lifestyle. That's what the most criticized part of his life, alcohol and maybe even drugs like cocaine, morphine and so on. On the other side, I have to say that especially during the Second World War, during his repeated visits to the United States, he did a great job. Not only on behalf of Czechoslovakia, this fight for liberation of Czechoslovakia, but even on behalf of all allies. And it was the British diplomats who asked, at that time, exiled President Beneš, please don't call him back from America because he is doing a great job. Then, of course, there were other positive parts of his life and his thinking. Like, for example, he was one of the few politicians of that time who was very strongly defended the Jews and their right for their own state. So, and he was very strongly criticized anti-Semitism throughout Europe, for example, as one of the first politicians. So he had many negatives, but at the same time he had also many positive sides of his personality.
If you look at his stay in the United States, I think you mentioned 7 years, right? Where did he stay?
Well, he stayed in several places. He started in New York because the friends of Thomas Garrigue Masaryk, his father, arranged some job for him as a lift boy and so on. He made a joke that he was the best dressed lift boy of that time because he brought to America, 6 wonderful dresses and so on. But then he was sent again, thanks to the friend of Thomas Garrigue Masaryk, famous Chicago millionaire Charles Crane. He was sent to Bridgeport, to steel company, working together with regular workers. So that's where he handled perfectly, I would say, slang English. So when during the Second World War he came to America, many Americans could not believe that he is not a Native American because of the very perfect quality of his English. New York English and slang English and so on.
So, Jan Masaryk was one of the many Czechs in America, and you wrote a book, Czechs in America. What do we know about the first Czechs, first people from what is now Czechia, who came to the United States? Are there a few names that you could mention?
Well, I would start with Joachim Ganz. He was a Prague-born Jew who is considered to be the first scientific scholar on American soil, what is today United States. He came to America and spent roughly 1 year on Roanoke Island with very famous colonization attempts organized by Walter Raleigh in 1585. And it is said that the small laboratory he created was the first scientific laboratory in the United States, or
what later
became United States. He was expert in metallurgy and mining expert, and he's supposed to be a brother of another famous Prague-born Jew, astronomer and mathematician Ganz David. Another man whom I would mention was the first historically known permanent settler on the US soil, and it was Augustin Herrmann, who became very famous because of a variety of things. He was involved in business with Peter Stuyvesant. He was among the first exporter of tobacco and fur to Europe. And he was also great cartographer in 1670, if I am not mistaken. he worked out excellent map of Virginia and Maryland, which was of such quality that next 60, 70 years it was used as the best map of this territory. So he was the one who permanently, in early 1640s, permanently settled in America. He became part of what was called the Council of Nine, with Governor Peter Stuyvesant in New Amsterdam at that time, today New York. So he really reached wonderful fame, and he was awarded for his services with some big tracts of land in Maryland, Bohemia Manor, and you still can see parts of this manor.
I read in your book that there's a mention of a connection between Jan Amos Komenský, and the kind of early Puritan communities in what is now Massachusetts, I believe. What was that about?
There is a story that Jan Amos Komenský was invited to be the president of the Harvard College. It was mentioned in a very famous ecclesiastical history of Cotton Mather, Magnalia Christi Americana, but many historians disagree with this because searching through the papers of Jan Amos Komenský, there is not a single evidence of this invitation. And the truth is that in 1642 Comenius left for Sweden. But at least it is a wonderful proof that Comenius was a man highly respected intellectual in 17th century Europe, all the way from England, Netherlands, Poland, Hungary, and even in the United States.
So they knew about him. If we go forward a little bit, and we probably get to the 19th century, what were the kind of main waves of Czech and Moravian and Silesian emigration to the US?
There was very, very limited individual emigration before 1848 because of feudal system that did not allow you to migrate freely. And it was only after the revolution 1848 when the new acts and new police legislation allowed at least some people to leave freely, be it to America or some other territories. And it was the first small wave of immigrants, Czech immigrants, were politically persecuted participants of the revolution in June 1848 in Prague and Vienna. Among them, there was, for example, very famous Vojta Náprstek. We have Náprstek Museum here in Prague, and several others. But this was very limited group of people. Then the main group started of those people who search America because of free land. For Czechs, land was more precious than gold in California, I would say. Therefore, you can find the first Czechs settled in Midwest as early as 1848, 1849. So this is the first, I would call, mass wave of immigrants to America that during first 5-7 years reach several thousands or even tens of thousands.
And now we are talking about communities probably in places like Iowa, Nebraska.
All the way from Minnesota to Texas, down to
Yeah.
Texas, all the Midwest.
Right.
But of course, some of them settled in big cities as well. New York, Baltimore, St. Louis, because it was relatively easy to reach these places, of course, thanks to transportation. Because at these times, you had to use transoceanic ship, then you had to use railway, then you had to use horse carriage and so on, or even walk several tens of miles to find your place. So the Czechs accepted offer of that time to get so-called homesteads. Domoviny in Czech.
Homestead Act, which
it was homestead during the Civil War.
During the Civil War, yeah.
Civil War, and many Czechs, of course, to receive a large tract of land of the size of a homestead was something incredible for many Czechs, because here in Bohemia, most of them had very limited amount of land for production. So they immediately wrote to their family members, to their neighbors, to follow them to America. And this is how it caused emigration wave. Of course, there were another, I would say, push and pull factors like activities of railway companies, agents, or transoceanic ships agents who spread information about America and attractivity of America in basically every village in Bohemia, in Europe.
You work with archives, right? I mean, very often. And, when I visited Ellis Island, the museum there of immigration, I came across a bit of a problem because a lot of the Czechs, because they were coming from Austrian-Hungarian Empire or from Austria, they said they were Austrians. And you see Czech names and they are Austrians. Is that something that makes it difficult, to research in the archives and to find out about the Czechs?
Well, of course, and the Czechs and later Slovaks were very critical of that because they did not consider themselves as Austrians. Ethnically, nationalistically, they were Czechs, Bohemians. So it was, if I'm not mistaken, only in 1910, before 1910 census was taken, there was huge activity on the side of Slovaks and some other Slavic nations in America who wanted to make statistics according to your nationality and not your citizenship. Because in case of Slovaks, that was the same situation. They were not Hungarians, according to them, they were Slovaks. And in case of Czechs, we are proud Bohemians and not Austrians. So it was only that after this year, 1910, when we have more correct statistical data on Czech immigration to America.
You are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and my guest today is Dr. Ivan Dubovický, diplomat, researcher, and author of Czechs in America, a new look at the enduring bonds between two nations and the people who connect them. So, if we look at communities such as Cedar Rapids, for example, where there's a Czech and Slovak National Museum and Library, that would be probably Czech communities that were predominantly farming communities originally.
Well, years ago I did some research on social structure of Czech immigrants to America, and I found that there was roughly 30% of Czechs who could be called as farming population. It doesn't look too much, but if you compare it with other immigrants, other nations, it is a relatively high percentage because, for example, in case of Italians, Slovaks, Ukrainians, most of them settled in the cities as industrial workers.
Like in Pittsburgh, for example?
Yeah, of course, yes. So this is really also another factor that it was many, at least at the beginning, during the first 3-4 decades, it was a family migration, which clearly shows that Czechs left Bohemia with the intention to settle in America permanently. It was not like these Italian golondrinas who left for America, spent 3 years, collected some money, came back to Italy, and so on. So we can really call at least the beginning of the Czech immigration to America, we can call pioneer immigration wave.
Yeah, I read somewhere that, quite surprisingly, a lot of the immigration that came to the United States in the second half of the 19th century, it was only, well, not a small fraction, but it was a fraction of those who actually went on to the West. Most of them stayed on the East Coast, in the big cities, as you said, and ended up as miners, industrial workers, etc. So were Czechs a little bit exceptional in this respect?
Well, they could be compared to those pioneer immigration groups like Germans, Swedes, Scandinavians in general, and so on. But, of course, many of them, because of the lack of the knowledge of language, many of them were forced to stay immediately in the cities. If you look at the history of New York, for example, majority of Czechs in New York were very poor tobacco workers. So because they didn't know what to do else, how to travel along the United States, and they tended, if they settled even in the Midwest, they tended to Germans, which is rather strange because in Bohemia they view Germans as their political opponents, of course, Austrians and Germans. But here, because the German language was something they knew, they had closer relations with Germans than with, for example, Irish people or Americans in general.
And this would be, I think, true especially about cities like St. Louis, Minneapolis, I think.
All of these, and even in small communities, if you look at the history of very famous New Prague in Minnesota, I had opportunity to search, to go through birth records. And you see that very soon there were intermarriages of Czechs and Germans. So they became friends, and Vojta Náperstek, for example, the very first journal published by some Czech was Vojta Náperstek journal dedicated to German freethinkers in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And in German, of course.
In German, of course. So there was very close relations. But the fact is that there was many industrial workers in all these cities, and the Czechs could be compared to other later immigration waves in this sense.
I remember visiting the small town of West in Texas back in 2013. There was a big explosion. There was a tragedy, and Czech Republic was trying to help. And I was speaking to the local people. Very few of them actually spoke any Czech anymore. But what was interesting, they were telling me they were mostly from Frenštát pod Radhoštěm. They were from this one area in Moravia. And as I understand, this was not very unique, that it often happened that because of some personal connections, that people from one place in Bohemia or Moravia just moved to one place in the United States.
In general, we usually consider this wave of immigrants as social and economic emigration. So you can find a similar situation in some other parts of Bohemia, that there is a cluster of villages from where people emigrated in a very short time span. And this was the case of Texas, which has a very interesting story, because it was the first Protestant minister, Bergman, who came to America and then sent letters to famous Czech writer Božena Němcová about the situation, free land, and so on and so on. And Božena Němcová published the letters in Moravské noviny. And the readers immediately realized, hey, this is our pastor, our minister. He wouldn't lie to us. So why don't we join him and leave Moravia? I have to apologize because we always speak about Czechs. Our Moravian neighbors would criticize me very much because, yes, they were proud Moravians and they are still very proud Moravians, those who came from not only Frenštát area but other parts of Moravia. And this kind of, I would say, mechanism caused chain migration. Brother wrote a letter to his other family members, and you have to join me, and so on, because the situation here. And this is how started even the first communities in Texas very soon. You can find 3 counties in Texas with a relatively very high percentage of people of Moravian or Czech origin, even today.
So, to sum it up, for most of the people who left in the 19th century, it would be true that they were socio-economic, as you said, immigrants. And was it just a kind of one-way street? As you indicated, the Italians had a kind of different pattern. I mean, they would stay for 3 years and then come back to Italy with the money that they made. Was that something that was nearly impossible for the Czechs?
At the very beginning, I would say it was impossible, because you have to imagine that you sold all your property just to get enough money for transportation and for the start in America. So many people were relatively poor. As I said, in New York, to make first money, they were involved in tobacco industry, and they still remained poor. So it was very difficult for them. And the second reason was transportation. the first ships after 1848 who brought first Czech immigrants to America, the transportation to America lasted up to 3 months. Can you imagine 3 months journey across the ocean? Then, of course, with introduction of steamers, this period shortened, but still it was financially nearly impossible for most of the Czechs to come back. Yes, there were some of them who came back as proud Americans, and you can see that their self-consciousness was much higher. They were not those oppressed Czechs as before. They were now proud Czech Americans. And you could see it even from dealing with Austrian authorities and so on, that they brought some money, tried to establish some business and so on, but then many of them left secondarily again back to America.
Because they found better life.
Yes,
there.
of course.
Yeah.
But speaking about this coining social economic migration, political migration, we have tendency to do it every time with each wave of immigrants, but I would like to emphasize that every time you can find great variety of reasons on individual level. You can call it political migration, but you can still find people who simply wanted to find better life economically and who were not politically persecuted. Yes, so it's always a mixture of reasons why people emigrated. As I mentioned, there were always pull and push factors. Yes, situation in Austria-Hungary on one side, and possibilities in the United States on the other side, be it gold in California or free land or job opportunities.
We've already mentioned the name of Vojta Náprstek, who actually was I would say a clear political refugee, because he left in a hurry in 1848, not to be imprisoned basically by the Austrian authorities. And just for the listeners, Vojta Náprstek later returned to Prague, and he started many kind of interesting institutions, such as the American Club for Women.
Yes. It was basically the beginning of feminism in Bohemia.
He started feminism in Prague.
Yes, he was very progressive in many areas, many ways. So, but the most important trace he left us is the so-called industrial museum that later turned to be ethnological museum as we have it today, Náprstek Museum of American, African, Asian cultures.
A lot of people will know that Antonín Dvořák famously came to New York later on in the 1890s, if I remember correctly. Are there some other names that we should mention?
There are literally hundreds of people who left their very strong trace, and not only those like Antonín Dvořák who came back to Bohemia, but those who remained in America. I can mention names from political sphere, cultural sphere, science, and so on, if you want to hear at least some of the...
Go ahead, yeah.
For example, in politics, I always like to emphasize, for example, Congressman Adolf, so-called the Judge Sabat. Can you imagine someone who was 23 times elected to US Congress? So he really served before the First World War as a congressman and ended up during presidency of Harry Truman. So, and he really had very deep impact on American social and immigration legislation. Then, of course, is very famous mayor of Chicago, Anthony Cermak. But there are many others.
By the way, let me just mention Anton Cermak, Anthony Cermak, was born in Kladno, not far from here.
Yes.
He came there as a young man. Go on, mention
Louis
some others.
Dembitz Brandeis, Supreme Court judge. He was already born in the United States, but his parents were Prague-born Jews. And for example, Judy Bartopinka, whom I had opportunity to meet several times repeatedly, unfortunately already deceased treasurer of the state of Illinois, and of course State Secretary Madeleine Albright, and her father, Joseph Korbel. Among his students, there was another state secretary, Condoleezza Rice, of course. And this is just speaking about politicians, Republican Senator Roman Hruška of Nebraska and many others. If we go to, for example, the science, I would start probably with Gerty Cori, born Radnic, again, Prague-born Jew, one of the first American women who received Nobel Prize. She was already American citizen at that time. Then, for example, Aleš Hrdlička. We have still his Journal of Physical Anthropology. He was the founder, a long-time director of Smithsonian, and many others who dedicated their activities, for example, to business. I would name just two of them. Joseph Bulova, very famous watch company in New York, and of course Ray Kroc. Who wouldn't know McDonald's owner Ray Kroc? Of course, then you have people like astronauts. Eugene Cernan, his father was Slovak, his mother was Czech, the last man on the moon. Then another astronaut, John Blaha, his grandfather was Czech. Opera singer René Fleming, sportsman, of course. We do not have a time to mention all these hockey players, but for example, tennis players like Martina Navrátilová, Ivan Lendl, of course. You have actresses like Sissy Spacek, Pavlína Pořízková. Everyone knows screenwriter, movie maker Miloš Forman, book illustrator Petr Sis, who repeatedly received several prizes for his works, for example, and so on and so on. So it would be a very long list of those who really remained on the US soil and left very strong trace.
Let me just mention, I'm kind of proud to say that I had the opportunity to interview Miloš Forman, but also Aja Vrzáňová.
Yeah.
And I spoke to Aja Vrzáňová, who was a figure skating champion, I would say. I interviewed her when, unfortunately, Valdemar Matuška deceased back in, I think it was in 2010 or something like that. So there are many things that
you mentioned Aja Vrzáňová, or Zánova, as she was known in America. She was a very good friend of mine, and I'm proud to be a friend of hers. So we met every year, both here in Prague and in New York. But we have mentioned several names, but I would like to add that there are another traces of Czech origin in America even today that are not connected so much with individual name. But look at the Sokol idea. It is deeply rooted in America. You have Sokol organizations throughout the United States, and as a matter of fact, right this year we celebrate 160 years of the Sokol. It was 1865 in St. Louis, Missouri, when the first Sokol organization was founded by Czech immigrants. So another impact, for example, Czech brass band music, polka. You have polka festivals in some areas of Midwest, Koláči festivals. These are also small traces of, small. For example, Sokol is not a small trace, it's a very deep impact on American physical culture, for example. So it's not only names, but even some of these ideas.
I think you already kind of indicated that, but if you were to kind of sum it up, the role of the institutions that the Czechs managed to develop, we mentioned Sokol, but were there some specifically Czech institutions in different parts of the United States that are worth thinking about and mentioning?
Well, the beginning of their activities was connected with fraternal institution. There was no social security system in America at that time, and for Czechs, and not only for Czechs, for many other immigrant groups, it was very important to have some insurance in case of death or disease and so on. So these fraternal organizations were among the first that occurred in America, organized by Czechs, and together with their main activities, there were connected cultural or sport activities, theatrical activities, and so on. So you can find CSPS, for example, Českoslovanská podpůrná společnost, CSPS. The first one, if I'm not mistaken, again was established in St. Louis, Missouri in 1854. So, and today there are several very large insurance companies who have their origin in this type of organization, Western Fraternal Organization, and so on. In Texas, you have another specific organization that started as insurance company, as still continues. during last decades, one of the most popular activities among Czechs in America is genealogical research. And it is wonderful because this research about your roots brought many Czechs not only to spread information about your family history, but many Czechs started cultural activities, social activities, thanks to this focus on their own personal history. And the Genealogical Society International in Minnesota, for example, that traces back to 1980s, is now one of the with highest membership, if I'm not mistaken, ever among all the Czech American societies. So it's very popular, and this also brings people back to Czech Republic to learn about the history of their ancestors and even to meet their distant relatives.
We now fast forward a little bit to 1989. Obviously, communism fell and it became not completely free. I mean, not completely easy to travel to the US, but many young Czech people, especially young Czech people, made their way to the US, and many of them stayed as well. But that was, I would say, purely economic emigration, was it not?
Well, as I said, it's difficult to coin each emigration word clearly because you have variety of reasons, but you're right, of course, the possibility to emigrate, like after communist coup d'etat 1948, it was basically impossible to leave legally for regular commoners. Now, after 1989, basically everyone can leave, and you see also the big wave of people, especially young people, who simply search for improvement in their academic career, in their profession and so on, but they still have opportunity to come back. And these, what we call expats, create new modern Czech immigrant communities in not only in the United States, but in some other Western countries. But the difference is big because there is wonderful connection between Czechia and them. There is no problem for them to bring their families back to Czechia. There is no problem to travel back and forth and so on and so on. So it really creates new forms of communications, and of course also due to new ways of communications, internet and so on and so on. So the situation is really differs very much comparing to those older emigration waves and their possibilities of contact between their original homeland.
I actually interviewed quite recently Matouš Glanz, who heads the Czechspats in Science kind of organization, and that's something that he keeps stressing. I mean, we are not krajani in folk costumes, I mean, there are young people who are there, and that kind of applies to the US as well as to other countries, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, of course, because the term krajani, it has some historical meaning. But on the other side, look at Vojta Náprstek. We mentioned Vojta Náprstek. He was political refugee, but he was proud to be called krajan because they came from the same area, same kraj. But I understand that today it has some too old meaning for these new immigrants. And also for example, political refugees after 1948, they too didn't like to be called krajani because they consider themselves exiles, political exiles. So you touch the problem that not always was the relations between these older waves of immigrants and the newer wave of immigrants were very constructive, I would say. Their aims and their tasks were different. The emigration after 1948 came to America with intention that in a course of 1-2 years, communist regime will be thrown out and they could come back. So you see that there was even political fight inside, for example, some of these exile organizations. Yes, so I understand that there were not so close ties between these waves, and the same can be said about this new emigration after 1989 and their connection to these old immigrants or their followers.
Let me mention that I interviewed actually recently Petr Brod, a Czech who was also a Czech émigré, and he was telling me how within the Radio Free Europe Czechoslovak section, that there were there were tensions. I mean, he speaks quite openly about it. First, there were tensions along the ethnic lines. I mean, there were Slovaks. Yes, then there were Jewish émigrés, and then there were some political kind of differences as well. And that was combined with the waves of emigration between those who stayed after 1948 and those who came only after 1968. And I suppose this would apply to the Czech, much larger community in the US, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. You can find it in all these societies, organizations that were created after 1948. And some people, some Slovaks, for example, had so-called Czechoslovak tendencies. Some Slovaks tended to autonomism or even separatism. And of course, this created sharp difference between themselves. And also, I would say their activities were directed in a different way. They always opposed communist regime, but their ideas about how to organize Czechoslovakia after communist regime differed very drastically, I would say. So you can find these tensions everywhere, I would say.
Looking back, over the centuries of Czech emigration to the US, what do you personally find most compelling or kind of moving about this story of Czechs in America?
I always tried, and that was basically the reason why I wrote that book that is aimed to very wide general public, not scientifically written, because I always felt that we here in what is today Czech Republic, we forgot the great contribution the Czechs abroad in general, and especially in the United States, contributed to us. Not only with financial support during both world wars, material support, but even intellectual exchange that enriched not only us here, it was both-sided, but this is what I think is most important, to continue these relations between old homeland and new country, because we can both be enriched very much, exchanging science, culture, everything, knowledge, and so on and so on. And I always feel that we really owe a big thank to our krajani, exiles, countrymen, and so on, abroad in general, and especially in the United States, for all they help us in the past, politically, financially, and so on.
Let me share this experience with you. Back in 2003, I was in the kind of press entourage of the then Prime Minister of Czechia, Vladimír Špidla, and we visited, among other places, we visited Houston in Texas. And there were Czech Americans who organized a kind of show for us. And they had folk costumes that were, I'm sad to say, but they were not authentic, very authentic. They were not authentic at all, I would say. And danced to the music theme of Dr. Zhivago, this big film from the 1960s that got a few Oscars, I think. But it's a Hollywood film about Russia, and it was actually filmed in Switzerland, of all places. But let me say, it was very moving, because they were really proud that they were Czechs, and with all these kind of imperfections, I would say, it was very moving, because they were really proud Czechs, and they wanted to show us that they are proud Czechs. Isn't that something that you came across too?
Exactly, absolutely the same experience, and you cannot be critical of the fact that their folk costume were not 100% authentic. They didn't have opportunity to import authentic folk costumes. They inherited after their grandparents small part of this, small part of that. So they had to invent, in a sense, their ethnicity. So they added new parts from, let's say, Yugoslavian ethnic groups or Russian ethnic groups. And it was not, and it is not important, because as you mentioned, what is important is their proudness of being Czech. And if you use some not 100% perfect symbolism, doesn't mind.
Dr. Dubovický, I didn't stress enough that your book is written both in Czech and in English. So whether you speak Czech or you don't speak Czech, I mean, it's definitely worth reading and going through. Are you planning anything new in this respect?
The problem is that the job at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not allow me much time to do research in the archives. But yes, I do right now, for example, I would like to finish some study on Jan Masaryk stays in America during the Second World War, and from time to time I had opportunity to write short studies, for example, Czechs in Brazil during First World War, and so on and so on. I hope in the future I will have more opportunities to dedicate myself and to write some really very solid, scientifically oriented book on Czechs in America and maybe in some other countries like Argentina, Brazil, and so on.
Something we would probably call in Czech odborná publikace.
Yes, exactly. But there are already very fine, very well-written publications by some young authors. So there is still a lot to research to do in this area, because there are still many archive sources unresearched, I would say. When I started doing research on this issue in 1980s, it was not very common phenomenon here in Czechoslovakia to speak about Czechs in America and Czechs abroad in general. But the situation is much better today after 1989. There are several young, wonderful scholars who wrote several books and a lot of studies, not only on Czechs in America, but generally Czechs abroad. And I myself would also like to contribute in the future. Unfortunately or fortunately, my job here at the ministry does not give me so much time to do some archives research, but I hope I will have the opportunity in the future.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Dubovický.
My pleasure, and I'm always glad to speak about Czechs in America and Czechs abroad in general, because they are very fine people.
So that was Dr. Ivan Dubovický, diplomat, historian, and someone who's dedicated time and research to understanding how Czech identity lives on beyond the country's borders. His book, Czechs in America, is, by the way, published both in Czech and English, and is a powerful reminder of the lasting connections between Czechia and its emigrant communities, especially in the United States. And during Diplomacy Week, organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it's also a good opportunity to reflect on how public diplomacy today builds on those historic ties. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone interested in Czech history or society, or anyone who's ever lived between cultures. And don't forget to subscribe to Czechast on your favorite podcast platform, so you never miss a story that goes deeper into Czech life, culture, and identity. I'm Vít Pohanka, and this has been Czechast. Thanks for listening a naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.